Such a nice sunny day outside, so I really appreciate your coming here. My name is Oksana Dudko, and I'm a Prairie postdoctoral fellow at the Prairie Center for the Study of Ukrainian Heritage, and today's lecture has been organized by the Prairie Center for the Study of Ukrainian Heritage, this very institution, in partnership with the Ukrainian Museum of Canada in Saskatoon. Many people are not from Saskatoon, so may I welcome you here, one of my favorite places in Saskatoon. And this lecture is a part of a series of events that mark the Prairie Center's 25th anniversary. So thank you for joining us to celebrate 25 years of the Prairie Center's academic excellence and service to the Saskatoon community. And I'd like to thank the interim director of the Prairie Center, Nadia Fotelnishchuk, the museum's director, Jen Budne, and the museum communication manager, Lindsay Revuski, for making this event possible. And it's an honor and a great pleasure and for me to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Mayhill Fowler, who came to Saskatoon all the way from Florida to talk about Ukrainian theater. And theater and performing arts have always been a significant part of Ukrainian culture. And theater has contributed to Ukrainian culture not only by giving us many excellent artists and actors and directors, but also by playing a key role in forming the Ukrainian nation as we know it today. By continuing performances during wars and resisting imperial persecutions, theater has always been one of the pillars of Ukrainian resistance. And I do not know, and I mean it, a more well-qualified person to tell you about the fascinating and complex history of Ukrainian theater. And Dr. Fowler is not only one of the most remarkable historians of Ukraine, but also a person who knows theater deeply from the inside. Dr. Fowler is an associate professor in the Department of History at Stetson University, and she holds a PhD in history from Princeton University and a BA in Slavic Studies and Literatures from Yale University. And she has published widely on culture in Ukraine, including a book called Beaumont on Empire's Age, State and Stage in Soviet Ukraine. And she's currently finishing a book on women in theater in Ukraine across the long 20th century, and hopefully you will talk a bit about this today, and rethinking a project on Soviet military theater. And Dr. Fowler teaches in the US, but you can often find her in Ukraine, where she is affiliated researcher with the Center for Urban History in Lviv and an affiliated faculty member in the program in theater studies at Ivan Franko National University, my home university. When I told you that there is no better person to talk about Ukrainian theater, I meant it, because not only has Dr. Fowler spent months studying archives in Ukraine and across the world to research theater, she has also developed deep, intimate connections with the Ukrainian theater community, and therefore knows many of the nuances of Ukrainian theater life. And I do not know any other person who attends Ukrainian performances as often and as enthusiastically as Dr. Fowler does. What's more is that Dr. Fowler's expertise in theater goes beyond historical research, I should say that, because she also holds an MFA in acting from the National Theatre Conservatory and is a former actress herself. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mayhill Fowler.
Thank you so much, Oksana, for that incredibly generous introduction. I hope she hasn't oversold this talk. And I want to thank everyone for being here right now. It is a beautiful day outside. So thank you for coming downstairs to hear a little bit about Ukrainian theater. So thank you so much for this invitation. This talk comes at the end of several days of discussing how we can teach Ukraine, and more broadly the region that is Ukraine, more effectively. And I'm pleased to have the opportunity now to share how I'm engaging with those same questions in my research. So thank you to Oksana Dudko for organizing, and the generosity of the Ukrainian Museum of Canada for hosting and advertising and making this event possible. So my talk today is on theater in Ukraine. And let me just say first that theater in Ukraine is important. You might think it's not as important as politics, but actually theater is a lens on politics and society and what people find important and how societies and states operate. In Eastern Europe, where people often did not have a state because they lived in those big multi-ethnic empires, theater was a way of creating community, belonging, even a sense of a nation. There's a reason that big empires often censored theater. They knew it was important, and they did not want people having that community that perhaps could push against the empire itself. So I want to tell you some stories about theater in Ukraine so you understand how it's a lens on society, on the state, on the larger questions even of the war today. But I don't only want to give you some stories of theater in Ukraine, but rather I want to tell you a larger story about why those stories are important, why they're so hard to hear, why they're not widespread, why theater in Ukraine is largely so unknown. And the fact is that theater in Ukraine is largely unknown, except to Ukrainians and specialists on Ukraine, and of course now my own students. So why is that? The answer is empire. Again, in general, theater in minority languages or minority cultures and empires can pose a threat, and empires can use physical violence to control it, or epistemic violence, making it seem unimportant, secondary, or even non-existent. In the Soviet period, there was a great centralizing pull towards Moscow. Moscow was where the center of the Communist Party was, and it was supposed to be where the best of everything was, the best university, the biggest politicians, the best theater. So everywhere else, including Soviet Ukraine, was supposed to be derivative, secondary. And in some sense, because of resources, this became true, but not all the way. Throughout the entire Soviet period, we can see different artistic movements and trends in Soviet Ukraine that were separate from what was happening in the center. But what's interesting, and that I want you to understand, is that scholars largely reproduced those Soviet categories. So they got grants and they went to Moscow to study Russian theater. Really, they were studying Soviet theater, but it was all calqued as Russian because Russia sort of ate up all the culture. So why would you study Ukrainian theater when you could study great Russian theater in Moscow? So the Soviet Union created these categories that Western scholars sort of uncritically largely reproduced, that great theater was at the center and local national theater was in the periphery and was not worthy of study. And we still see that even today. Russia got the avant-garde. Those artists were largely from other places, working in other places, but they got absorbed by Russia. The story of theater in this region, however we define it, is this. There was theater in Russia that happily led to the creation of the Moscow Art Theater by Stanislavski and Nemirovich Danchenko. Then Vsevolod Mayhill created a more physical, constructivist style of theater. Then there was some other experimentation, like with Yuri Lubimov or Anatoly Afrons. And then the Soviet Union collapsed, and theater in Russia is still great, and Moscow is still the center, right? That is a huge general sketch, right? But that's basically sort of the narrative of theater history if you looked at any textbook or sort of general survey of Russian or Soviet theater. Fascinatingly, I'll just note that Nemirovich Danchenko is part Armenian from what's now Georgia. Mayhill is part Baltic German, and Stanislavski, real name Alexeyev, is the only one from Moscow. The empire gathers people and erases place from their biographies. And I'll add that actually most scholars in the West of theater in Ukraine are actually of Ukrainian origin, the diaspora or Ukraine itself. And so sort of to tread this path of researching theater in Ukraine has been a really interesting journey. It often takes a personal interest to really explore non-Russian theater, so to explore quote-unquote minority theater, to really delve into a place that is not the purported center, when the center might have more access to grants or resources or funding. So what I want to do for you today is break this narrative, right? We're gonna challenge this slide. I'll try to counter many ideas about Russian culture, showing how important it is to decolonize our thinking, to reconstruct center and periphery, and to explore the texture of place more fully to capture artistic creativity, why and how artists create the art that they do in the places that they do when they do. So let's focus in on theater in Ukraine, by which I mean the lands that are Ukraine. The borders have shifted for sure, and let's see what might have been going on here in this place. And I want to make an argument for you. And this argument is that theater in these lands has often been about resisting empire. It doesn't mean that artists were consciously resisting empire at all times, right? Of course not. Sometimes they just wanted to make a salary or make really great art that people came to. But I do think in this region, we can pull out a thread of resistance to large imperializing projects. We can see that time and again in the theater that is produced in this region, that it's often creating some kind of push against or counter narrative to greater imperial culture. And that's perhaps something specific about making art in this region that was always a space of imperial negotiation, right? People were always living within shifting borders. It was a place of great diversity and a place of large imperial projects. So in this talk, we'll be covering 3 stories of theatrical resistance. The first professional Ukrainian language theater and its star, Maria Zankovetska, who created successful careers in the Russian Empire and a counter-narrative to imperial culture. Second, Les Kurbas and his Berezil theater that used cultural connections with Europe to create a theater that was Soviet, but that was also Ukrainian. And finally, after the Revolution of Dignity in 2013-2014, new laws and a new generation that really ended the Soviet legacy in the arts, creating theater for a democratic Ukraine. These artists are still creating theater today in war. So let's look at these 3 stories of theatrical resistance and then see what it might mean for today. So, this is one of my favorite people, and I know there are other people here who appreciate her. Let's start in the 19th century. This is Maria Zankovetska. She's a 19th century diva of the Ukrainian stage. And yes, there was a Ukrainian stage very active in the late Russian Empire. There was in the Habsburg Empire as well, but interestingly, the large corpus of Ukrainian language plays was written in the context of the Ukrainian language theater happening in the Russian Empire. Why? This question becomes even more puzzling when we realize that at the time, the Russian Empire actually prohibited the publication and performance of the Ukrainian language. With the 1863 Polish uprising, it was considered dangerous to promote Ukrainianness. But to make a long story short, and the long story is actually really interesting, a group of ex-military got together and moved from amateur theatricals to professional Ukrainian language theater in the 1880s, working around these state prohibitions. And they were popular, and their theater really took off. Because they performed throughout the southwest regions of the Russian Empire, where there were garrison towns of soldiers guarding the border or fighting with the Ottoman Empire. They were fighting in these multiple Russo-Turkish wars at the end of the 19th century. So this was a people of people crisscrossing, stuck in these garrison towns, needing entertainment, so you had a willing audiences. Now these artists had to write an entire repertory because of a censorship stipulation that European or Russian plays could not appear in Ukrainian translation on the stage. So they had to write all the plays to perform, and they did. And because this region was a breadbasket and a center of serfdom, had been a center of serfdom, right? They wrote plays about the failures of emancipation and the struggles in the post-emancipation village. These are melodramas, but actually we learn a lot from them about the challenges of the village life in this time. Violence, class, property, and women generally losing out each and every time. They were called the theatrical, the theater of the stars, and they were stars. Right? When you read their correspondence, there's a lot of moving between companies and arguments and reforming groups and fighting over money or personal relationships. But they were everywhere in this region, and in fact, they even performed for the Tsar in St. Petersburg during a time, ironically, when they were prohibited from performing in the Kiev region. And it was on this trip that Zankovetska actually posed by invitation for the photographer taking photos for the Russian edition of Darwin's Expressions of Emotions in Humans and Animals. Her facial expressions were considered so expressive that she was selected to pose for this book. Zankovetska could have stayed in the capital. She was a brilliant actress. She was invited to stay and perform there, but she preferred to go back to Ukraine, the southwest region of the Russian Empire as it was then. The companies she worked with were actually largely Russian-speaking. Their correspondence unfolds in Russian, but they were devoted to place, to Ukrainian lands, Ukrainian people, Ukrainian audiences. Their theater was specific, and it was shaped by place. They created a belonging in empire. Zankovetska was especially beloved. She played heroines who suffered at the hands of men, landlords, and fate. And her singing, her eloquent and melodramatic acting in the style of Eleanor Aduza made her a star. And the rumors of her love affair with lead actor Mykola Sadovsky, who left her time and time again, made her even more popular. But despite her roles of betrayed village girls and rumors of her sad romantic life, Zankovetska was a thoroughly modern woman. She came from wealth. She was married to a Russian military officer and should have been a good officer's wife. But she fell in love with the stage doing amateur theatricals, and she left her husband and her social position to serve the stage. Think about that, right? What that would have meant for a woman in that position to do that in the late 19th century. She demanded money, she demanded billing, good parts, and she never stopped developing herself as an actress. Letters suggest that people thought she was high maintenance, right? And she probably was, but why not? She was a star, she had star appeal, and she was the reason people often showed up in droves to see the show. She left the theater after the 1917 revolution. She didn't feel she had any part to play in this new theater that was kind of slowly emerging through the years of civil war and new Soviet power. But she lent her name to a new theater company. She met with young artists and supported them. And when Mykola Sadovsky died in 1933, the authorities designed his funeral procession to go past her window, since she was too immobile to leave her home at that time. I'll note that today we might critique, and in fact a lot of the young theater scholars I know in Ukraine do critique, this Karifei repertory is a product of censorship, right? It is a colonial product, a product of colonialism, oppression, too redolent of the empire. But I think it's important to reflect on how, at the time, they created these stories that really resonated with their audiences, and there's just no denying that they were enormously popular. And I think of everyday Ukrainians coming from villages to these mid-sized towns in the taverns where these shows are being performed, and being able to hear stories in their own language, and stories that, however wildly melodramatic, clearly in some way were their stories, right, and resonated with their experiences. But the Karifei remain unknown largely outside Ukraine. And Zankovetska, she lived this truly extraordinary life, and I'm not sure why there's not more written about her and why there are no books in English about her. So what would happen if we put them at the center of our study of 19th century theater, right? So no kind of provincial theater leading up to Stanislavski. What would happen if we put the Karifei at the center? We might see, for example, the ways that military life shaped the arts in the wars at the end of the 19th century leading up to World War I. We might see the ways that imperial minorities created new audiences. And in fact, this is quite interesting. Both Yiddish and Ukrainian theaters created these repertories despite censorship. Yiddish theater too was censored, but too was wildly popular, performing in this same region because it was part of the Pale of Settlement where Jews were legally allowed to live and work in the Russian Empire. Again, in these garrison towns, in these villages connecting them, who lived there? Ukrainians, Russians, and of course Jews, and of course they were audiences anxious for entertainment. There's even one story of a Ukrainian theater actress marrying into the Fish Zone Jewish theater clan. There's probably more, but no one's really looked. And my suspicion from having read about both theaters is that while the plays were different, that the acting styles were very similar, and the shows still offered a window into the lives of local people of empire. And I wonder if this story of itinerant troupes of Jews and Ukrainians speaking to these local audiences might be more significant than Stanislavski and his company on their trains. It is said that Stanislavski shaped American theater, but just as significantly did Yiddish theater. Stella Adler, who translated Stanislavski for an American audience, was the daughter of Yiddish theater stars from Odessa, Sarah and Jacob Adler. So focusing on the Karifei makes Stanislavski fade. He becomes one story among many of people hustling and bustling, trying to make a career in the empire. Some people saw Stanislavski, but many more, I think, saw one of the many itinerant troupes speaking their language and telling their stories. So moving on, having complicated the 19th century, let's skip forward to the 20th, and let's talk about the subject of my first book, Les Kurbas and the Berezil. So as you may know, in the 1920s, this was the largest state-funded theater in Soviet Ukraine in the capital, Kharkiv, and it was extraordinary. Yet it remains known largely only to Ukrainian specialists or Ukrainians. Kurbas was himself from the Habsburg Empire. He was the son of itinerant Ukrainian-language theater actors, but he was highly educated. We're not sure what classes he attended at the University of Vienna, but he was there. And he was at university in Lviv, Lemberg as it was then, and he saw all the latest productions in these cities that were really centers of creativity. He read in multiple languages, he was interested in philosophy, how actors could create stories on stage, convey them to the audience. He was an innovator. And actually he was also an entrepreneur. I think we often think of him as this sort of quiet, aesthetic genius. But he was also one of those artists kind of always forming a theater company. He started in 1915 in Ternopil under Russian occupation, no easy task. And then he moved to wartime Kiev and started a company with a bunch of amateurs, also no easy task. And then he created a new company touring around Kiev when armies were literally fighting in the area, also no easy task. He came to Biela Tserkva like the day the Poles left. Remember that war lasted in this region far beyond the classic end of World War I in 1918. The war lasted here through 1921, and sort of while armies are moving, he's sort of showing up and doing Macbeth in Ukrainian. And in this time and in this place, he created new techniques, he trained and inspired a generation, he gathered together new repertory, he linked up with the best playwrights in Soviet Ukraine, and of course, ultimately he managed to threaten lesser talents, the Soviet state, such that he was arrested at the end of 1933, sent to Solovki concentration camp in 1934, where he still directed theater, and shot in November 1937, with over 100 of the top intellectual and cultural elite of Ukraine. But his legacy lives on. This is my favorite show. It's actually not directed by him, but by his three proteges, all of whom would become major figures in theater after Kurbas's murder in 1937. It's actually a really important story. He died, he was murdered, but his legacy really lived on, and when you look at who's running theater in the 50s and the 60s, they all come from this sort of world of Kurbas. So this is the first ever Ukrainian musical review. It's called Hello from Radio 477, and it was inspired by cabaret shows in Weimar, Berlin, where they went actually in the late 1920s. They saw a bunch of shows, high theaters, low theaters, everything in between, including at a cabaret called Scala, which was really known for its line of dancing girls. They also bought lighting equipment in Berlin, which actually, if you look at those circles in the back, I believe those are those lights that actually they bought in Berlin and brought them back to the Soviet Union. So this was a very utterly European-influenced cultural product, but it was also pure Soviet Ukraine. It had a lot of jokes about Moscow, of several kinds, but always basically making fun of Moscow, thinking they know everything when they don't. And that is what's really interesting. This show positions itself at the center. It was also unlike anything in all of the USSR that I've seen. Anytime I present on this show, no one knows quite what to say or has been able to identify anything similar. Here we have, on the left, on the bottom, an actor playing comic writer Ostap Veshnya, who is hunting, and he really did go hunting, and he meets a line of dancing girls dressed as ducks, and he's gonna shoot them, and so Baba Yaga comes out of that hut and locks him in a vishnyak, a cherry brandy bottle. So it's really strange, but it's really awesome, and it's a totally local theatrical product telling a really local story, and in that it's resisting the pull to the center, which is so typical of imperial culture. And I've been thinking recently about how it's really a post-colonial moment, right? Think about this. This was after Empire, right? So all of these artists think they're coming out of Empire, right? And so they're kind of playing with this relationship with the purported center in really creative ways, right? This relationship between the colonizer and the formerly colonized is productive. It's one of play and creativity at this moment, because it's not yet fully clear to them, although it soon would be, that that relationship was far from over, right? And that Moscow did not want to allow Soviet Ukraine to be anything but a new little Russia. At this moment, it's still this sort of fuel for creativity. Beyond Berezil, I want to highlight another aspect of theater in this golden age of Soviet Ukraine, which is Yiddish theater. So most scholars of Yiddish theater know only about Solomon Michoil's and Gosat, which is the state Yiddish theater in Moscow. But they were a very niche company in Moscow. And what you have to understand is that the heartland of Yiddish theater was in Ukraine. This is where the audiences were. This is where there was a Yiddish division of the theater school to train artists for all of those companies. It was where there was a Yiddish puppet theater that won second place in an all-union puppet theater competition. And it was where there were several, not just one, state-supported theater companies serving audiences in Yiddish. And this fact also reminds us, I think, of the multi-ethnicity of Soviet Ukraine, of this region, which I think is one of its markers and one of the key features shaping creative production. Jews, Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, they're all making Soviet Ukrainian culture. I've seen a lot of directors crossing over, a lot of designers crossing over, working in this theater, working in that theater. And I think there was a lot of mutual inspiration. As we can see here, this show, Schlag, The Little Devils, is from the Yiddish theater in Kiev in 1929. So the same year as Hello from Radio 477. You see here a line of dancing girls. Clearly, it's a contemporary variety show aspect going on here. Very similar to Hello. There's a lot of social connections between the artists working in these two companies. I don't know archivally a lot about this show, but I think it suggests that there's a lot of creative inspiration going on between all these artists. We tend as scholars to separate Yiddish theater, Ukrainian theater, Polish theater, but in a place like Ukraine, of course, all of the artists are working together and they all know each other and they all know what's going on in their different troupes. And I think that actually there's a larger argument to be made here about the benefits of diversity. And in fact, Ukraine is a case study in the ways that diversity impacted artists to shape their creativity. So despite the homogenization of Soviet culture, right, everything kind of gets drawn to the center, what unfolded in Soviet Ukraine was different and kind of reflected its own influences. So think about this. What if we moved our lens from Stanislavski and Meyerhold and included Kurbas in wider studies on Soviet or indeed Eastern European theater? We might see how diversity matters in theatrical production, how creativity can come from imperial borderlands as much, if not more, than centers. We might see a longer trajectory of theatrical practices from Habsburg Vienna, Polish modernism, that took root and developed here in different ways and could actually be really interesting for scholars of that theater. That Kurbas remains so unknown to scholars of 20th century theater is a consequence of this violence of categories, the erasure of the centrality of the perceived periphery. So I'll skip forward again to the 20th, 21st centuries, to wartime pre-February 2022. Another specificity to this place that is today Ukraine is the transformation of cultural infrastructure that was successful in the post-Soviet period. Unlike in Russia, Ukraine actually very seriously cut a lot of funding to the arts after the Soviet collapse. If you were to go to the theater in Russia, which I would not recommend now, but if you were to go, on programs you see the emblems of, for example, banks that are connected to the Kremlin. It's the Kremlin that very much stepped in to support the arts in the 90s and still does so today. And this is, by the way, why it's so important to avoid artistic projects with artists still working for Russian artistic institutions. In doing so, you are literally supporting the war and the murder of Ukrainian artists. But in Ukraine, this funding was really slashed, very much so. And that's hard, of course, but it demanded creativity. And so people created new workarounds, like co-productions, multiple theaters working together for a show, grants, applying to Ukrainian institutions or working with theaters abroad to create a production. new ways of thinking about the audience, right? Hiring PR people, right? Increased social media presence. In 2015, MP Ira Podolyak put through a package of legislation that changed the administrative structure of theater, called the theater laws, making, for example, 5-year positions for artistic directors, not life. Getting rid of the previous position of managing director, which had been sort of the admin responsible for party ideology in the Soviet period, and making all appointments transparent, right? You could even watch proceedings on YouTube. There was a lot of discussion and debate about these laws, and rightly so. Since 2015, we can see a lot of the challenges. Just because you have new laws doesn't mean you have new practices. But what I will say is that these laws actually changed the landscape, and actually kind of quickly. They really brought a new generation into theater leadership. And we saw a lot of new faces, a lot of women, interestingly, and new funding opportunities and new institutions such as the Ukrainian Cultural Fund and the Ukrainian Institute, both of which funded and promoted new people, new projects from new places. Again, I'm not denying any of the challenges. Now, anyone who's been following the story of the Ukrainian Cultural Fund, for example, knows the challenges that institution has faced and is facing. But I would also say as an outsider that even the fact that people talk so openly about frustrations with the cultural policy of the state and demand change highlights a real difference, not only with the 90s, but also with Russia today. Artistic civil society is really active in Ukraine. Decentralization politically, which is the topic of a lot of pre-2022 research in political science, for example, also means decentralization culturally. And theaters began to receive more local funding, right? Funding from local city councils. This could be complicated because some city councils didn't do their part to support the arts, but some really did. Like in Lviv, with small grants programs, for example, to support a new production, or a trip to a theater festival to perform, or, as we see here, repair the roof on a local theater. This new cultural infrastructure, new people, new funding opportunities, new relationships with society, shapes what stories can be told. Unlike in Russia, where theater has still to rely on between the lines and subtext, in Ukraine, theater can speak directly, and they do, and they've spoken directly about the war. On my Fulbright in 2019 to 2020, I was in the theater like far too often. I saw probably 60 shows, and I would say over half were about war. And theater is telling war today. I haven't been to those shows because I haven't been to Ukraine since February 2022, but Oksana Dudko has. Many of my students are still there. So there are theaters right now that are creating work that is directly about the war today. There's panels on theater during the war, active discussions, debates, sometimes very angry, on social media. But theater is active. The discussion about theater and how to tell the story of the war theatrically is really important, and is happening. Even with the challenges of war, the lack of resources and funding, having to go to a bomb shelter during a show, theaters are making work. And more importantly, telling stories of the war. And they're doing that in these new infrastructures that have nothing to do with the Soviet. This is the Soviet Army Theater in Lviv. The building actually has a long story. Again, I'm trying to rework a book that I was writing about it. But it is the former Soviet military theater in Lviv. This was the only Russian language theater in Lviv, moved there from Odessa in 1954. It went through a series of several iterations. It is now called Teatr Lasy, and it's a very cool Ukrainian language, hip theater that is making work that is really of the moment. It might be to your taste, it might not be to your taste, but it will always be interesting, and the people who work there are deeply, deeply engaged in telling stories of Ukraine. I can't think of a more on-point example to show the transformation of cultural institutions away from the Soviet than a former Soviet military theater becoming a hip Ukrainian language theater run by women. And this story of theater during wartime is important because the stories we tell about war tell us about ourselves and give us narratives on which to hang trauma. How Ukraine processes this brutal experience depends largely, I think, on the work of artists to create ways for that processing and that meaning-making to happen. So what if we paid attention to how Ukraine and Russia have had totally different paths in the 30 years of independence for cultural infrastructures? We might want to include other cases, and we could think about factors that lead to radically different outcomes. By separating the different artistic landscapes coming out of Soviet-style communism, we can see how artists learned to create with a market, with differing levels of state support. We'd also see Ukraine as a part of European theater. I can point to the ways that residencies, grants, and festivals throughout the EU shifted the theatrical landscape in Ukraine away from Moscow and towards Europe. That's a European story. In fact, I remember hearing years ago in Poland, and I actually don't know if this is true, but that theaters could get funding if they did collaborations with Ukrainian artists. And so the development of theater in Poland is not separate from the development of theater in Ukraine, right? It was very useful for those collaborations to happen. And of course, there are now Ukrainians working in Europe, in Poland, in Germany, and shaping the development of those theatrical cultures. And ultimately, scholars of theater may look back at 2022 and see it as this important moment driving cultural development in particular countries like Poland and Germany, where so many Ukrainian artists have gone. We'll have to see if there's movement back in the other direction once the war is over. There's a lot to research. And it's really a window onto state and social development during wartime. But I would say the study of Ukrainian theater has been sidelined in two ways. Relegated to the periphery in the study of Russian Soviet theater because it's not great and it's merely a national folk theater or lesser Meyerhold, and sidelined by Eastern Europe or Europe because it's actually too Eastern. It's too Soviet. Ukraine falls away. But the story of the last 30 years and how Ukraine has retooled the relationship between the state, society, and the arts is crucial for understanding the rich response in theater and not only in the war today. Theater today is part of the landscape of war, and we should study it to explore how people respond to and survive a war of aggression. And that response in Ukraine is different than the response in Russia. Let's take a peek at the Russian-occupied regions of Ukraine. In fact, the Donetsk Music and Drama Theater is still operating. There are even a few actors who've been named People's Artists of the DNR, and their website lauds the fact, as we see here, this is from last fall, that they were able to perform in Mariupol for the first time since 2014. They actually performed a very strange play called Two for the Seesaw by William Gibson, which was a relic of Soviet repertory. What are they doing today? They are producing a new opera on Tolstoy from Prince Andrei from War and Peace. So in case we think that Tolstoy is separate from the war or Russian literature is separate from the war, I think this story shows that it is not. They see it very much as part of the war. They're also, they've been doing concerts called Ya Znаю Pravdu with the Z, shown throughout Russia. I read a little bit, so I went down a rabbit hole yesterday about this. This is based on testimonies that they took in 2018 from people in occupied territories. So I would say theater is creating narratives. They're creating narratives in the DNR, and they're taking those narratives about the war and what they think the war is to Russia. And so I think kind of considering that and thinking about then the narratives that artists are creating in Ukraine today helps us understand how theater is a cultural front of the war and how very important theater is, because it is a place that people understand what is happening to them and the meaning kind of the world around them. And in Russia itself, there are many plays of war, even if not directly about this one. You can see right now War and Peace at the Vakhtangov, or at the Theater of the Russian Army, you can see their new production of a play called Barbanchitsa, The Little Drummer Girl, which is a play from 1959 that became the touchstone production for the former Soviet military theater in Lviv, when it was a Soviet military theater, this theater that is now retooled as Teatr Lassi. Barbanchitsa is a classic of the Soviet military repertory, performed now nowhere else than Russia and Belarus. And we see here, there's a lot one can say about this production, but this is the end where our heroine has died, and the people on stage are looking at photos of veterans of the Second World War. So again, we see very directly, right, what Russia is doing in its theatrical landscape. I think studying these divergent paths since 1991 helps us understand these different stories and these different narratives, these different worlds, these different relationships between artists and the state in Russia and in Ukraine. So these are the three acts that we've experienced today for a recap. 19th century Ukrainian language theater, creating a sense of belonging in empire. 20th century theater in Soviet Ukraine, creating experimental modernity in the Soviet space. And 21st century theater in Ukraine, solving the post-Soviet crisis of infrastructure in war with a future that, although uncertain, I think we know that great theater will be in Ukraine. So let's think about this. What if we put this narrative of theater in Ukraine, resistance to empire, at the center of our study of theater in this region? What if we took this region as central, or as central as Moscow or Warsaw or Vienna? What if we switched our hierarchies and focused instead on place, unwinding the imperial thread and its imperial hierarchies that dictate which shows or artists we deem worthy of study and attention? Then we might really figure out how diversity leads to creativity, or how different state structures encourage the arts, or how art gets made where it does, when it does, and ultimately today what it means to tell war on stage. And in fact, by decentering the narrative, we might really come to understand something about theater and about Ukraine. So thank you so much for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions.